Now, it started with the very first piece of Star Wars content in the Disney era, with the novel A New Dawn back in 2014, which was a book that was essentially a prequel to the then upcoming Rebels animated series, a novel where two of the main characters from that series, Kanan and Hera, would first meet. It was also a novel where, with the introduction of the character Captain Ray Sloane, as well as the inclusion of female stormtroopers, it was implied that women had always just sort of been there or been a part of the Empire, despite never having seen one on screen in the original trilogy, and Captain Sloane would just be the beginning of many, many more female Imperials to come. And no, I'm not about to complain about this inclusion. Quite the opposite, actually. I was completely fine with it because I'm someone who firmly believes good and bad people come in all shapes, sizes, colors, genders, sexualities, and so on, that we should never assume anything or label anyone based on what we see, positively or negatively, because it's the actions of the individual that at least should ultimately define us as a person. In fact, this is basically one of the things I love about Star Wars, that what oftentimes shapes the future of the entire galaxy are the choices and actions of a single individual in the moment, them choosing between being selfish and selfless, or that sacrificing something they want for the greater good can determine the fate of so many. And though very, very few of us will ever make a choice of that magnitude in our lives, each and every one of us will still make choices, whether we realize it or not, that affect or shape the very world and the people around us. In other words, yes, absolutely populate the ranks of the Empire with women and every other type of person you want. I am all for that. The Star Wars galaxy is huge, and for some reason there's more humans than anything else. So let's show the range of humanity and the good and evil we can all bring about. Show that selfish and evil behavior is, well, it's not limited to stuffy white British guys, which, intentionally or not, you could argue the original trilogy implies. Though yes, I know some of you are probably ready to take to the comments to politely point out to me that there were already women shown to be in the ranks of the Empire in the expanded universe. Not to mention just a whole lot of women, and really well-written ones in general, in the expanded universe. In fact, many of the female characters in the EU became favorite characters of male readers, myself included. Which I know is kind of hard to believe, even though it shouldn't be when you really stop and think about it and ignore what many try to claim today, that men outright just reject any and all female characters who are inserted in, let's call it for the sake of simplicity, more male-geared entertainment like comic books, sci-fi, fantasy, and so on. And don't take that the wrong way, ladies, or men who want to get offended and speak up for them, which is kind of ironic considering the topic. But anyway, women can and absolutely do and should read, watch, and get into all of this sort of stuff. My wife loves it just as much as I do, loves Star Wars comics and all these things as much as I do, and it's one of the million reasons I love and married her. And I even have a second channel where we basically just have fun and talk about, well, we mainly talk about Star Wars, but we also talk about our other shared passions for all of this stuff. All I'm trying to say here is, and even George Lucas once said he made Star Wars for 12-year-old boys, is that in general, it was made more or less, or was originally conceived or aimed at boys and or men. A lot of this stuff was. And that if you break down the numbers, even today, more men than women do get into this sort of thing. Which, no, doesn't mean women shouldn't be encouraged to get into it or have some content geared more towards them to encourage them to indeed get into this kind of sci-fi, fantasy genre stuff. And actually, the crux of my entire argument here is they deserve better crafted or written female characters in general to be able to get more into it. And along these same lines, they shouldn't be hated upon or stigmatized for getting into this sort of thing, though it's oftentimes other women who do this to them. My wife has talked about this before on that aforementioned second channel, that growing up it tended to be other girls who gave her flack for liking Star Wars and reading fantasy books from authors like Mercedes Lackey. And kind of on the flip side then, men shouldn't be sort of chastised for the fact that, yes, more of them like, say, comic books than women do. That doesn't automatically mean something is wrong with the comic book industry and that it needs to be fixed because it's not some sort of perfect 50-50 split between men and women who read them. The same way no one should get upset or would ever even think of getting upset and claim it needs to be fixed, that something like the Hallmark Channel is watched by many, many more women than it is men, that on average, women like feel-good movies more than men do. But anyway, getting back to my point, hopefully, there is now this commonly pushed belief that men are automatically going to reject any and all strong female characters inserted into more male-oriented content, again, called that for simplicity's sake. When there is, at least in my lifetime or in my experience, there's nothing but proof to the opposite, starting with the fact that right in Star Wars, the leadership of the rebellion turned out to be mainly women with Princess Leia and Mon Mothma, and I have never once heard a single male Star Wars fan take issue with that. But it doesn't begin and end there, and though I could go into characters like Sarah Connor from Terminator and Ripley from Aliens, the often cited examples of strong female characters in more male-oriented shows or movies, or that there have been numerous female superheroes in comic books long before the MCU came about and brought the genre truly mainstream, I'm instead going to go to cartoons, the cartoons of my childhood in particular, which is mainly the mid to early 80s and late 80s and beyond. Because back then, and maybe still today, I don't honestly know, I don't watch many kid-oriented or aimed cartoons these days, but virtually every kid watched cartoons back then, and pretty much the same ones because, well, there really weren't too many options back in the day. And just the other night, actually, I started to watch some old episodes of the original early to mid-80s G.I. Joe cartoon here on YouTube. Apparently, the Hasbro channel runs them 24/7 because of the 40th anniversary, and it popped up in my feed, and I was compelled to click and take a trip down nostalgia lane. Anyway, this was one of the shows I absolutely loved as a kid, and while watching it, my wife started watching it with me, and I guess you could say she was a little surprised to see just how many female characters were in it, and on both sides, both Joe's and Cobra. And at one point during one of the episodes, Lady J even comes out of virtually nowhere to kick Cobra Commander and essentially saves the day. That made her chuckle, and she jokingly asked me if that pissed me off as a kid to see a woman beating up Cobra Commander and saving the other Joes in the process. And though I knew she was messing around with me, I told her that no, that back then, and sure I can't speak for everyone, I can only speak for myself, but I never even thought about that or cared about the fact that she was a woman. She was just another member of the team in my view. And that was hardly the only cartoon I watched back in the day that had strong female characters in it that stood side by side with their male counterparts and kicked butt. Even He-Man, of all characters, the ultimate male-sounding character, had Teela, who stood by his side and could kick just as much butt as him usually. Pretty much all of my favorite ones had female characters that had very prominent roles and were very strong and again were kicking butt alongside their male counterparts. Now, was it a perfect 1-to-1 ratio of man to woman in all of these old cartoons from the 80s? Well, no, a lot of the time it was not. But sometimes it actually was, or really close to it, especially with cartoons and more kid-oriented shows from the 90s that I may have watched from time to time despite moving into my teens and 20s in the 90s. But anyway, a lot of the time these cartoons and or shows were just men and or women working together to stop a common threat or enemy of men and or women, with gender rarely ever even being brought up or being relevant. And if it was usually in a good-natured kind of humorous ways. The boys and girls would have a little competition, one side would win, and that would be about the extent of it. It was never presented in a truly overly positive or overly negative way, if you will. It wasn't like the women of a cartoon or show were always saving the day after the incompetent men botched the job or failed to beat the bad guys and got themselves captured. Or the women constantly complaining about how they get treated differently and have to have things explained to them by their male counterparts, and that they never get the respect and credit they deserve. Yet oftentimes today, and She-Hulk, the first episode, is an example of this, female characters that are in these, again, more male-geared genres or forms of entertainment, well, they fall into one of these two sort of categories, or sometimes both. They're either presented as just as good and as strong as men just because they're women, and a point about that has to be made afterwards, that's showing that, yes, we are better than men, and or everything they accomplish is extra hard because they're women, which sounds like a completely contradictory message, but whatever, I guess. And it turns out this will apparently be the case with the character of Dedra Meero in the upcoming Star Wars series Andor, where the actress Denise Gow recently said of her character and her experience in the Empire that, as a woman in that world, for her to advance in any way, she has to be like 10 times better than anyone else in that room, and that felt really relevant to everything we're going through right now. And look, first of all, if you really want to make the Empire the bad guys who blew up planets and rule the galaxy with an iron fist, if you want to make them a patriarchy, I guess go ahead and do that. I prefer what we talked about before, showing that the Empire represents, you could say, the possible worst nature in any and all of us, that they were more of a generic evil, but whatever. I'm really trying to stay positive about Andor because I want this show to be good. I want it to be what I think is a bit more of a mature or evolving Star Wars show, which I feel the franchise needs. Regardless of that right now, and going back to what she said, well, I'm not here to say that the world is completely perfect and or fair, and that women do not face challenges that men do not, or that men don't face challenges that women do not. And actually, in a way, a big way, those old cartoons of the 80s and those shows I watched where the male and female characters were more or less kind of interchangeable and just complete equals in every single way and respects, well, that was a good message and a well-intended one, and something I do believe fully in, that we should all be treated equal, no matter what your gender is. But it's still a rather unrealistic one. Because, and I know I'll probably catch some flack for some of these things I'm saying, but I'm trying to have a civil conversation. But in general, or on average, men and women have different strengths and weaknesses, which is not a bad thing. It's a great thing in my personal experience because it tends to mean we complement each other very well. My wife and I, for example, we share similar interests, as I talked about before, but there are some things that I do better, and some things she does much better, and together we form an amazing team. And no, I'm certainly not saying it's got to be a man and a woman who complement each other and make a great team or partnership in this world. I am all for people finding the right person for them, no matter who that might be, and finding happiness with someone else no matter what. I mean, who am I to decide who you're allowed to love? All I'm really saying here is that on average, men and women are, yes, a bit different. Which doesn't mean women can't be just as strong as men in many ways, even physically, even though if we can be real for a second, men do tend to be physically stronger than women. But making female characters more or less just better versions of men is kind of insulting to women, isn't it? Aren't they more than that? Much, much more? Don't they deserve more nuance out of their characters than that? And at the same time, do you honestly think men are learning a lesson from any of this? Or is constantly being berated and showing up in the entertainment that used to be, again, more kind of geared towards them, could it possibly be having a negative impact? But then again, who cares if that's the case? They're only men, and we of course have women to save the day for us. Well, that's all I've got for this time, and yes, I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek in that final line, but either way, I would love to hear from you, man, woman, whatever, and tell me what you think about all this. Is this a good change in entertainment? Is this teaching men a lesson? Are we learning something? And do women enjoy the way they're being presented in these comic book films or similar related properties? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk. And until next time, thanks for watching.